will commence recording and get started. I hope everyone is well, and I see most folks enjoying great weather across the state of Washington. That's absolutely fantastic. So let me do one little thing and then we'll get moving. Okay. So welcome all. Today's meeting, as you know, is hosted by the Washington State Healthcare Authority, and this is an interactive meeting. We encourage you to ask questions as you normally do and participate throughout the session. For your information, the slides and recording will be sent by email after the presentation. We're hoping that folks are receiving those. And if not, we continue to share them in the chat as we go along. And Laura indicated, I purchased the book to accompany the meeting. Fantastic. It's a fantastic read, easy, concise, but very informative. And I hope anyone who has the opportunity will acquire the book or at least have access to it to kind of guide their engagement and interaction. Certainly helps in that manner. So we'll get right into our housekeeping. Certainly we expect that you'll use the chat or raise your hand on the Zoom bar if you have a question and to respond to polls as we get along. And I guess got great news. Shelley is with us. So that's fantastic. So I'll just wrap up the housekeeping and then I'll have Shelley jump in and we'll get into our rhythm today. You certainly have the option of downloading the chat and we'll, at the end of it, remind you as to how to do that. You go to the three dots at the end of the bar and you indicate, it gives you the option of save chat when you scroll down and you have the option of doing so. It's, how would I call it? It's not far from the smiley face. So it's approximate to the smiley face. So you can see that option. In terms of audio, and I know I provided that information to someone already, you have the option of using the Zoom audio if you have challenges with your video option. The quality information, the ID and password for this meeting. So also there, you have the option of using that. You're expected to keep your audio muted to reduce background noise and for us to have maximum engagement. Certainly, it asks if you respect that. And the video option, your video can be on and off. We certainly understand clearly that some office environment does not allow for that, but if you have the option, certainly we prefer that you do so. And if your video is on, obviously your parents and background should be appropriate. So I will segue to Shelley and we will get started.
Thank you so much, Earl, and I apologize for being late. It's my last day here at Rutgers and I locked myself out of my office, which is not great, and I'm very sorry. And thank you, Earl, so much for getting us started. And as Earl probably mentioned, we are transitioning to Earl taking over the learning community, which he's been here on so many of the learning calls, and we're co-presenting today. So I'm very happy to kind of transition nicely to that today. Just as a comment, subtitling is available on the Zoom bar under the three dots, show subtitles. So if you'd like to see subtitling, I'd also like to apologize. I lost my voice. And so I'm speaking a little differently for those of you who have been on previous calls. And thank you, Kimberly, so much for your kind words. So to go over, as we do at the beginning of each of these learning communities, here's the schedule for all the meetings. Again, we meet monthly on Tuesdays from 9:30 to 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time and then Pacific Daylight Time in the fall. It's generally the fourth Tuesday, but I think in December it's the 3rd. So here's where we are. And as Earl mentioned, for those of you following along in the book, this also has the chapter we cover each month. It's not required, but if you would like to, it can be very helpful. So we're talking about reducing acquiring today, chapter 8, and next month, Earl is going to be covering sorting and removing stuff, which I feel like people have been asking about. So this is going to be skills and strategies and information as part of a 2-chapter series on sorting and removing, very focused on strategies and activities. So I think those are going to be really helpful sessions for folks. Just as a note, it was originally marked that on next month in August that the learning community was going to be on the 16th. It's actually on the 23rd. So you'll be meeting with Earl on the 23rd. Ashley Kraft from the Seattle, the Clutter Support Coordinator of Seattle Housing Authority, has put the information for their monthly meeting. And so if anybody wants to talk to Ashley about that, she's here in the meeting. You can write to her in the chat privately. I think she'll also maybe stay on a little bit after if people have questions. So thanks for putting that information, Ashley. So again, this is the monthly schedule. So now we're going to do a quick review from June for those of you who were here, but also I know that not everybody comes to every session. So welcome to those who have been here and welcome to those of you who it's your first session. So in June, we covered Chapter 7, Enhancing Motivation. We've talked about motivation throughout Buried in Treasures, but this was specifically focused on eliciting motivation around change behaviors. And we talked about it from the perspective of there often being a dissonance between one's perception of themselves and others' perception in terms of clutter, cluttered spaces, in terms of specific behaviors. And so thinking about how seeing those differences and kind of processing those differences and then thinking about values, personal values, is a place where motivation can come from, about seeing how kind of other people perceive it and kind of feeling some of that can kind of be a point to start to elicit some motivation. In addition, kind of getting into, if you start to see that dissonance, and if people start to see the dissonance, it can get people into reflection about one's own story. And this was part of the process we talked about, right? Thinking about where did these behaviors begin? Are there specific life events or traumas that precipitated them? What is my story? And that can really be a place to think about what's important, what are my values? And again, not everybody's going to be like, this is the right time to make a change, but this can be a point to think about values disconnect, and think about how to start to declutter. And from there, we talked about 2 resources, an unclutter visualization and a clutter visualization, to start to make those changes when motivation is elicited. As a note, the presentation and recording were sent out by the Washington Healthcare Authority, as they are after each session, but they're here in the presentation. At a number of points, I put today's presentation in the chat. I can put it again. There are a bunch of clickable links to resources. And so that is something, Earl, can you put the presentation again in the chat? So you can click here also when it's sent out to you if you missed it and want to take a look. So at the end of each session, we ask you, thanks, Earl, we ask you to try some of the resources we talked about. And so just kind of think about, did you try or share? Again, we talked about personal values, the perceptions of self versus others, and about clutter and unclutter visualization. So I have a poll here, which is about the review, if you can take a moment to complete that. So first of all, did you attend the 628 meeting, which was last month? Yes or no? If you attended, did you try or share any of the following? So comparing perceptions, comparing your perceptions to others, personal goals worksheet, or the clutter or unclutter visualization. Or is that not applicable? And if you tried them, how did it go? Were they generally helpful, somewhat helpful, unhelpful, or not applicable? And for those of you who tried them, think about what were the feedback, what were the responses, and does anyone want to share any of the situations you used it in, anything that you learned, because again, it's helpful to know how the tools actually were received, where they were used, because again, some people weren't there, haven't tried them, and it's great to know how they're being used. So take a moment to complete that. And if anybody would like to share, you can put it in the chat. If anyone wants to raise their hand and do that, just be aware that it's being recorded. But I'll give people a moment to reflect. Oh, and Earl, can you also share the resources, the learning application resources in the chat as well? So Earl's going to share the resources that we're talking about, the Comparing Perceptions, Personal Goals worksheet, and Clutter and Unclutter visualization. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll in about 5 more seconds if anyone else would like to vote. So all those resources are in the chat from last month. If you want to take a look at them as a refresher. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now. Thank you to those of you who voted. And it looks like, okay, we have about 50-50, which is what we tend to have who've been here last month. So welcome back. So if you attended, what did people try? Okay, so some people tried the Comparing Perceptions of Self to Others, and Unclutter Clutter visualization, that's great, and Personal Goals worksheet, a few fewer people, and then some people not yet and not applicable. Sorry, I should share those results. And so if you tried them, how did it go? So we had, okay, great. Nobody found them unhelpful that shared. That's good to know. And there was a split between generally helpful and somewhat helpful. Great. So if anybody would like to share, if you found it somewhat helpful or generally helpful, or if there was something that was difficult, here's a moment to reflect and share. Because again, a lot of you said you haven't gotten a chance to try them yet. So it's good to hear that feedback again. And again, for writing, I'm giving people a moment to reflect. So I know that people may be writing now. And for the purposes of kind of vamping, I just wanted to say, which I was going to say at the beginning, that it's really been a complete pleasure to be here, to be able to work with the Healthcare Authority of Washington State, and also to get to know so many of you and learn so much from you. As I've mentioned, I'm going through some familial stuff right now in terms of unclutter and kind of really viscerally living through it in a very personal way while we're doing this, in addition to my kind of academic interest and background and service. And so this has been a really important, I think, group where people have shared very carefully and respectfully some personal things, some professional things. And so I just really appreciate all of that and what people have given to this group. And I know that Earl is going to continue this for the remaining 5 sessions after it. So that was kind of vamping for time purposes, but that was, if I hadn't had kind of the Murphy's Law, everything that can go wrong will go wrong on your last day of being late. I just wanted to let you know that. So okay, is there anybody who would like to share? Great, so Melody, visualization works great for me. I'm a visual person, so looking at a space and making a plan has been really helpful to discard things I have in storage. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that kind of visualization. Some people are visual people. Some people you can visualize kind of in your head. Some people maybe even drawing it, if they're very visual people, might be helpful. So really thinking about what works best. And I do think so much of a focus is on kind of getting rid of emptying a storage unit, emptying a room, which can be very, as we've talked about, that kind of clear out can really kind of be rough on people and actually make people kind of hold closer to things that, if you think about it, giving people the option to test their reactions to things being uncluttered can really help you determine what are the easier things to unclutter first or to have people work on, so you're not hitting the hardest things. And that can be really great to know where to get started. So I'm really glad to hear the visualizing was helpful, to have that guard, to have that guide to go with. That's really great. And Sarah Lynn, I'm glad that also you're a visual person, so that if you didn't get a chance to try it, I think that could also be helpful for you. Taking before and after pictures are very encouraging. Thanks, Debbie Lynn. Yeah, so thinking about keeping a record, that could be for you, that could be for the individual, but yeah, seeing some of those changings, it can also be a good thing to think about when people are like thinking, oh, everything's gone. That can be a way to see, okay, well, you still have a lot of things, like it could be a thing to reassure people that they still have a lot of things. It can be a way to see progress if somebody wants to mark that, but yeah, pictures are a great way to visualize. You can I like to sketch and to have sketches of things. If I'm reorganizing something, I'm also pretty visual. So it could be a mental image. So these are all different ways that can be good ways to get started. And like Debbie Lynn said, she can find that, and she's found other people find it very motivating to see that change over time with photos. Great. So it's great to hear that the clutter visualization, unvisualization, clutter and declutter visualization will be helpful. I do highly recommend those as a nice entry-level thing instead of just starting to get rid of things or helping people to do that. It kind of moves people gently into it. So again, those resources are there in the chat and also in last time's presentation. So please take a look at those. And we're now going to move into the content. So thank you for those of you who shared. We're going to keep it moving. So the learning objectives for today's session are, first of all, to talk about what is excessive acquiring. So to define that and to identify some strategies to address excessive acquiring, both some short-term strategies that people use and hopefully some longer-term strategies. And that'll involve going through a 4-step process that's in the chapter of ways to work towards kind of being able to describe and kind of identify thoughts associated with it, and then to start to make changes for other behaviors. So that is what we are going to do today. So excessive acquiring. Ooh, I went backwards instead of forwards. So excessive acquiring, this is really about acquiring that happens beyond someone's ability to use the things that they're acquiring, right? Having multiples of something, having something that somebody doesn't have use for, beyond someone's control. So the person actually thinks like, maybe I wouldn't want these things, but they feel compelled to acquire them. And then also beyond their means. And this could be beyond financial means. This could be beyond space means. So whatever means mean, it could be beyond financial. Laura, one in, one out. Yeah, that's definitely a way to address. And we're going to talk about rules in a moment. You can make rules for yourself. And Laura, that sounds like it's a rule for you that you've made. That's a rule I have for my partner in terms of bikes. He buys used bikes and fixes them up. So I have the one in, one out, although he has so many right now. I'm doing 2 in, 1 out, but that's a whole other issue. So you can make these rules for yourself. And we're going to talk about some rules that Buried in Treasure sets out as a possibility, in addition to rules you can make for yourself like that one. So thanks for sharing that. I'd also say not every item people have is for use, right? Some things are sentimental, some things are familial, so you don't have to use everything, but these are some categories, but they're not exhaustive. Not everything has to be used. Some things we are kind of for sentimental purposes, feel kind of compelled to have, but these are kind of 3 categories that are often used to think about excessive acquiring. Excessive acquiring could be through buying things or obtaining things for free. It could also be things coming in like junk mail, things like that, receipts. So there's many ways in which things come into people's homes. And we've talked about how there is, like, in the kind of post-World War II American ethos, this idea to acquire. So we're being pushed and advertised to acquire things. And so it is complicated to think about what's excessive. So we're going to kind of keep that in the back of our head. And we talked about that really during session 1. And so most people that have hoarding behaviors, who have excessive clutter, right, have excessive acquiring. It's estimated to be somewhere between 65% and 80%, right? But it's not required. It's not in the, for hoarding disorder, it's not in the DSM criteria. It can be a feature, but it's not at all required. And just think about how much comes into people's spaces that isn't necessarily about excessive acquiring. I had students in a waste class a few years ago log all the garbage they produced. And it was a ton over a period of, I think, 4 days. And so much comes in, so much goes out. And so once you stop having things go out, things accumulate very quickly. And so people don't necessarily have to excessively accumulate. And I think that's an acquire to actually have issues of excessive clutter. And I think that's important, that it isn't really a feature for everyone. Yeah, Melody.
While I'm thinking about it, I just wanted to
Yeah.
share, and I don't know if anybody else knows about this, but I live in King County and in the Federal Way area, but they have what they call their South King County tool library.
Mhm.
And so like I went there and rented a rototiller. But part of the reason they do this is, so people don't have to acquire tools that they only use once a year. But you can, they have everything like sewing machines and, stuff for households. So anyway, I just wanted to share that.
That's wonderful. And I think there are a bunch of people from King County. So Melody, if you want to put that into the chat, I know there's a bunch of things where there's community shares for lots of different things, for sewing, for bike repair. Yeah, a lot of things, yard and home equipment, tools. I think that's like a wonderful thing. And I think making people aware and seeing if it's accessible. Yeah, because there's also things I know, like with, sometimes neighbors, if you're in a more rural area, people will share things like a snowblower or something like that. Like there are these kind of formal and informal community sharing. So that's absolutely a way to kind of think about an alternative to acquiring things, even if it's like I need it once. That might be something to think about. So that's really wonderful. Thanks for sharing. So Debbie Lynn, that was in King County in Washington State. But I bet there's other things. So if you can share that, that might be something you can Google in the area you're in if you're in another part of Washington. But that's excellent. And Debbie, and Melody, you also said that sometimes you kind of have clutter with emails. Absolutely. Not everything's physical. And that can be really stressful, having, 10,000, I think my mom has 10,000 unread emails. And I look at that number and I'm like, how does she do it? Because it's, the same thing, you save it for later, you're on a lot of lists. And so cluttering can also be kind of e-cluttering, which also makes it stressful and difficult to sign up for a lot of lists. That can also feed into some online shopping and things like that, even if it's not physical at the time. So thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I think Carla, renting things. Absolutely. I remember when I was younger, there was a friend who had a giant SUV, and it's like when I move in and out of a place once a year, and it's like you could rent that. So I think this is kind of in the American ethos of ownership as opposed to renting or sharing. So it's definitely something to think about. And especially for people who have limited means, being able to borrow things, share things is also making things more accessible, and you don't have the clutter around them. So yeah. So think about, and I have a poll here, have you seen excessive acquiring? So first of all, from your experience with people with hoarding behaviors, excessive clutter, how often do people excessively acquire? Always, sometimes, almost never. Is this not applicable? So how much do you see this? I said it's about 2/3, a little over 2/3 of people with hoarding disorder, but how often do you see it? And then for people who excessively acquire, how often do you see people acquire either beyond their use, beyond their control, or beyond their means, financial space, or is that not applicable if you haven't seen people excessively have excessive clutter or acquiring? So take a moment to complete that. But yeah, Sarah Lynn, I think that we often think of the physical but you can actually have online things that are beyond your financial means. There's a lot of things you can buy, ebooks, subscriptions. I had something that I looked at like 6 months ago about how many subscriptions I had to ebooks, to a site that checked my grade. Like I was just like, I had over $100 a month because I was looking at my finances and I was like, what are all these subscriptions? So these things that you kind of acquire, it doesn't have to be physical, and they can have real consequences in terms of stress levels. Because when we're thinking about a lot of the excessive acquiring, yes, it's financial, yes, it's in terms of space, but it's also mental energy, it's stress, it's discomfort. And we'll talk about this with the feedback loop of acquiring, but you can absolutely over acquire online, and the thing isn't necessarily physical. So that's definitely something to think about. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll in 5 seconds if anyone else would like to vote. I've gone through thousands of photos on my computer and got rid of what turned out to be duplicates. I was just doing this morning. Yeah, so thinking about the accidental photos, the duplicates. Michelle, I find that most consumers, they're everyday and beyond any of their abilities for use, storage, financial ability. So most of your consumers. Thank you, Michelle. So I'm going to end the poll now. Okay, so about half of you are saying you see excessive acquiring all the time with clutter. Then about 40% sometimes, and only 1% almost never. Okay, so this is really something you're seeing most of the time, which is what the research shows. And for people who excessively acquire, a lot of people beyond use and beyond means. So those are two really big things. And beyond control, still about half of people are saying you're seeing that, but not as much as the other two, which is hard to know if it's not about yourself, if it's beyond someone's control, because that's kind of subjective, right? So that's a hard thing to talk about. Sorry, I didn't share the results. So those are the results. Okay. So Laura, you have a client who must accept everything offered to her for free, including clothing that won't fit. But if you think about, this is just something, the kind of proliferation of free stuff, right? Just think about if you work for an agency, how many pens, how many notepads, how many things like that. When you go to a workshop or a conference, people are handing out kind of cheap bags that fall apart right away. But how much of this stuff is being produced in part because it's so cheap to make? Right? Because of container ships that carry stuff, because of bad labor practices, environmentally bad things. There's so much cheap stuff. And so, even without asking for it, I've started saying no when people hand me pens and pads, because I'm like, it's just proliferating and I don't use them. And so that is something to think about, like being offered for free. Like we all get offered stuff for free. And sometimes it feels like you can't, a water cozy, a new kind of cheap water bottle. Like this stuff happens a lot, especially in agency contexts. So that's something definitely to think about. So as I've been bringing up, what is excessive acquisition? If people are being offered so much for free, if advertisers are telling you, and I think I read like something like 10 years ago, that the average American buys 64 pieces of clothing every year, 64 pieces, and it's probably higher now, 64 pieces of clothing, but that's not considered excessive acquisition, right? And so the question is, what is excessive acquisition? And so how do you know, right, acquiring is excessive or is in excess? So again, I mentioned this beyond use, beyond control, beyond means. So those are ways to think of things. And actually, Earl found this wonderful resource, the Savings Inventory Revised, which it can be used individually. And Earl, can you put this in the chat? It's also available, clickable in the presentation. This can be used for somebody to self-assess themselves. It's more generally for hoarding behaviors, and potentially if someone should be diagnosed or go for diagnosis for hoarding disorder. But what I wanted to focus on is some of the questions specifically about excessive acquiring. And this can be helpful. You can ask these questions. Somebody can ask themselves these questions, right? Because I don't think there's a standard. If the average American's buying 64 pieces of clothing, I don't think there's a standard for excessive. I honestly would say that the things that are excessive, it's based on your financial means. It's based on the rate at which you discard things. Like those are the things that make things excessive. So that's something to think about. Like, what's your feeling of control? What's the individual's feeling of control? What are their means? What are they able to use? What is their space? So that's something to think about. And so again, this savings inventory revised, here are some questions. It's a Likert scale that's from, when you respond to these questions, from I have none of this to almost all or completely. So questions that have to do with acquisition. So on this revised, so these are the ones that have to do with excessive acquisition. How much control do you have over your urges to acquire possessions? None, no control, to almost all complete. So if you have almost no control, that's something where that could be a problem with excessive acquisition. If it's like somebody mentioned, I feel compelled to do this, I feel like I have no control but to take free things, then that's something that might be excessive. How distressed or uncomfortable do you feel when you don't acquire something? So that's something also that might be a problem if they're getting stressed, distressed, or uncomfortable. How strong is your urge to buy or acquire free things for which you have no immediate use? So thinking about use, you have no use for the item. How upset or distressed do you feel about your acquiring habits? This is often something for mental health conditions. And this is within this model. Now, this might not be a mental health condition, but if you're looking at it in this model, do you feel upset or distressed around these behaviors? And to what extent has your saving or compulsive buying resulted in financial difficulties for you? And that's about means. And so again, the savings inventory revised, you could have somebody complete this themselves and talk about it. You could ask some of the questions. If you're like, I'm not sure this is excessive, and you want to talk to somebody, you could pick some of these questions, not even using the form, but just ask people these questions. And that could be a really good way to kind of get into someone reflecting, is this excessive? Because I would argue in general in the US, we all have excessive acquiring. The question is, what are our means? What is our space? And how quickly do we get through things? But that's just me. So Debbie Lynn, chapter 8 was very insightful. I'm in a weight management program and have lost over 30 pounds. So I realized I'm buying too much food for the space of my cupboard. I'm using acquiring form to help me. That's great. And I think it could be food. And I think that's how personalized it is, and really reflecting on that. And it could be a certain type of food. It could be shelf stable versus food that goes bad. So that's really nice that you're using those forms to be reflective. And I think you're talking about the form we're about to talk about. So mental health and some medications can exacerbate compulsive behavior. Monitoring can be important. Absolutely, Carla. And I think that is important, that some of this is absolutely things that have a relationship to other mental health conditions. We've talked a lot about anxiety. There's some overlap with obsessive compulsive disorder, with depression. And so there's absolutely things to think about there, the combination. So and how often do you feel compelled to acquire something? This is again about feelings of control. So that is the savings inventory revised. Now, commonly, the way to manage excessive acquisition is about avoidance. And this comes up in chapter 8, that often the way that's recommended is to avoid the situations, the places that you acquire things, kind of white knuckling it and kind of removing yourself. So for example, if you're hooked on Saturday morning yard sales, do something else. Don't pass them, walk down a different street, block the website you shop from. So this is like an avoidance strategy. And so think about, what's an example you have of avoidance that you've seen someone use to avoid, or that you yourself have used to avoid? So is it not going somewhere? Is it blocking? Yeah, Melody.
Are you blocking Amazon?
Blocking Amazon.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Or taking the app off my phone.
Absolutely. I don't have certain apps on my phone because I'm like, I can't control my behavior, so I'm going to avoid them. Absolutely. That's a common, great example. I think, Laura, you also had unmuted yourself. Was there something you wanted to share? Avoiding thrift stores. Yeah, uninstalling. Absolutely. You stole my strategy. Yeah, so that's something. I have a thing like on my phone that it gets dark and I can't see it after a time, so I can't do things after a time. These are all things to avoid, right? And so, yeah, so you can avoid certain situations. You can try to block things if these are things that feel that they're out of your control. Are there any other strategies that people use to avoid? Keep on another moment. I've noticed that I stop the way home to buy a food item. I have 40-minute commute. I may be a snack or something. I consider leaving my debit card at home so I can't buy on my way home, but then I worry I forget to put it back in my purse when I later need it. Absolutely. And I lived in New York City for a long time, and I have these long commutes, sometimes an hour, hour and a half. And yeah, it's very easy to kind of pick something up. And the question is, do I make my money less accessible? Do I bring a snack with me so I can't purchase something? I used to always say I had an emergency granola bar. So I'd like have a granola bar. And I didn't want the granola bar, but it's like, it was something so I could tell myself you can't get something out. So the question is like, that's like a strategy kind of thing. But yeah, if I take things out of my wallet, I forget to put them back. So it's not a good idea. But yeah, removing the card, removing a way to purchase. Absolutely. Empty my Amazon cart to avoid reminders. I use across from the Goodwill. I started not driving over because I could, you only take out what you can carry. Angela, yeah. So thinking about that, like I only have a bag this side. I can only carry this much to reduce how much you're doing. Absolutely. Jessica, I have to delete my card info from online shopping and not leave my debit card at home. Absolutely. Because they always say, do you want to save your information? You can always say, no, don't save my card information. That's absolutely waste that you have to physically, and this is going to go into the strategy we're going to talk about, but you can make it more difficult for yourself. And so very quickly, I have one more poll. I want you to think about, this is about avoidance. People can keep posting, but I have a very quick poll. So have you seen or used avoidance of acquiring? Have you used avoidance yourself? Have you seen avoidance or neither? If you've seen or used it, was it a long-term successful strategy to reduce acquiring, either for you or the people you see it? Because I feel like avoiding can be helpful, but what I've seen it is it's often short-term. And it's often short-term because what if it's stressful? So the example of getting food on the way home, if I'm having a really stressful week, I often will get kind of like extra stuff on the way home. I'll, do online shopping. It's very hard if you don't kind of rethink things. Avoidance is the thing when you're on your best day, when you're doing the best things, but kind of distress or stress can totally kind of ramp things up. So take a moment to do that. Yeah, stress acquiring is a real thing. Sticking to a list when shopping. Thank you, Eliza. Yes, avoidance is a short-term thing. What we're going to do is longer-term things. So you are jumping ahead. Thank you for bringing that behaviorist perspective. We're going to talk about strategies that are not avoiding. So I hope that's helpful. I was kind of leading into it and then saying, actually, it's more of a short-term solution. So thank you for bringing that up. No. I'm glad you brought it up. That's why there's the poll question about it. I'm glad that you brought it up. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now. Sometimes my scaffolding. Thank you to those of you who voted. So a lot of people have used avoidance, have seen avoidance a little less, but have used avoidance. And about half of you say was that it's generally successful long-term, about 40% no. And I'm going to say that here I'm sharing the results. I'm going to say that because not many of you are seeing avoidance in other people, it is because stress acquiring, distress acquiring are so much part of it, especially for people with problem clutter behaviors, problem acquiring behaviors, that it is because it's such a coping strategy often for distress, often a joy-seeking activity. And so it can be really hard to avoid all the time. You can do it sometimes, but it's not really a best practice. It's kind of a more short-term behavior. So thank you to those of you who shared. Continue to keep posting. I'm sorry that I didn't get to reply to everyone, but thank you for posting your strategies. I hope they're helpful to each other. So what we're going to focus on is a 4-step process to change acquiring. And so thinking about avoidance can be helpful, but really thinking about, for people with problem acquiring, thinking about actually making changes, kind of in that cognitive behavioral triangle. We had Elisa say she's a behavioral interventionist. So thinking about the relationship that we've been talking about, that cognitive triangle of, feelings, thoughts, behaviors, kind of intervening in that. That's where Buried in Treasures tries to make the interventions, not really just to avoid. That can be a strategy, especially a short-term strategy, but these are longer-term strategies that are going to be helpful in terms of changing patterns of behavior. So, and I apologize about my voice. I'm just realizing that it's quite strained. So we're going to go through each of these steps, and the steps are to first discover what, why, and how you're acquiring. So some observation. Then changing your thoughts about acquiring. We're going to talk about the acquiring feedback loop and how to try to interrupt that. So step 3 is to learning to tolerate triggers, environmental, social triggers that can trigger acquiring. And then the 4th is to develop alternative sources of joy and coping. Because if people remember, we talked about, I think 2 months ago, that oftentimes behaviors, whether it's acquiring or holding on to things, is often a source of short-term kind of joy seeking, pleasure seeking, or it can be a strategy when people are stressed, distressed, uncomfortable. And so thinking about alternative ways to kind of soothe oneself or to seek joy. So sorry you're hearing static. I hope other people aren't. If you're having difficulty hearing, scroll back and you can call in to hear the audio a different way if you're having difficulty, because it might be your connection. So I hope that's helpful, Angela. Okay, so these are the 4 steps. I'm going to talk about steps 1 and 2, and Earl is going to take you through steps 3 and 4. So let's get into step 1. And Earl, can you share? Oh, thank you for putting that in the chat. So if anyone's having difficulty hearing, you can keep watching, but you can call in if you're having some difficulty. I hope that's helpful. Melody, thank you for confirming there's no static. Step 2 is a tricky subject, but we are going to get into that with some hopefully tips and resources, but a lot of these are difficult. So discovering what, how, and why you acquire. So a way to get into the what and how is to track. And I think this came up, who mentioned this? I think Debbie Lynn, you mentioned this. You tracked what you were doing in terms of food coming in and then realizing you were acquiring too much. So I love doing this with students, with people, like with anybody. I think just getting a handle on like what's happening is really helpful, because then you can make an assessment of what's going on. So tracking everything that comes in, it could be for a day, for 3 days, for a week. I think a week is a good period to kind of get a sense, and then pay attention to one's feelings. And so this is the My Acquiring form. Earl, can you share this in the chat? It's also clickable here in the presentation. So what you're going to do is, and you can try this out for yourself, you can help somebody to use this. You're going to, for a period of time, and again, I think a week is a good period, but if you want to start with something shorter, you can definitely do that. You're going to list everything you get and how you got it, right? Where you got it. Was it somebody handed it for free? Did you purchase it somewhere? You can put as much detail as you want and would be helpful. And so thinking about, so the form is the second form from Oxford Clinical Psychology, and that's from the book. And then thinking about how uncomfortable would you feel if you didn't get it? From 0, would you feel fine if you didn't get it, to awful, like you feel like you really need this. Now, if it's something that you'd feel awful not getting, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem, right? Because you could be acquiring over the course of a week medication that you need, right? Or something that you really need and use. And so this is not the end all be all. This is a place to kind of think about then, which we'll talk about in a moment, another resource. So you're just logging everything and thinking about, right, how did I get it? What is it? And do I feel like I need this? Is it a 10? I really need this, or a 0? It'd be okay if I didn't get it. And I think that feeling is, I don't think I'd feel fine if I didn't get it. That's a really great place to kind of start and intervene, because those are things that the person's getting that maybe they feel like they'd be okay without. And so that's actually a good place to kind of start and thinking about how to cut back on some of those things. So think about, what are some things that, Debbie Lynn, you mentioned you use the form for food. So what are some things that you've seen excessively acquired? So take a moment, you can kind of reflect. If you want to share some of those things in the chat, you absolutely can. I need a moment. I'm just gonna have one moment, but put some of the things that you have seen excessively acquired, that you've noticed about yourself. Again, this is something you can give a try to see kind of what's coming in if there are things that you excessively acquire, but what are some of the things? Clothes, shoes. Yeah, makeup, absolutely. Crafting supplies, magazines, ooh, makeup, absolutely. Yeah, and people have things that like really kind of stand out to them. Absolutely. Beauty products. Yeah, a lot of beauty products. Clothing, books, antique knickknacks. Absolutely. I come from a place where it's all about frogs. There was a revolutionary battle and they thought the British were coming, and no, it was frogs mating. And so they blew up the frogs. It's actually very sad. But so everybody collects frogs. My family has like 1,000 frog knickknacks, which is fine, I guess, but it's too many. They can't even display them. So kind of those knickknacks, sometimes on a theme, blankets, shoes, t-shirts, socks. Yeah, absolutely. Collectible items, teapots. Yeah, so many teapots. And now I have the hot water thing, and teapots aren't even like useful anymore. Baby items, tools. Yeah, Laura. I'm also dealing with a lot of storage containers, Lance. Absolutely. And then I lose the tops, but I keep the storage containers in case I may magically find the tops at some point. Online sites for genealogy research. Yeah. So thinking about saving different things, coffee cups, mugs. Yeah, I only have mugs. I can't do glasses. I need a handle. So many mugs. Absolutely. And you only use one or two. Absolutely. So there's lots of the things. And this is a great way. These are reflections you're having about yourselves. But this kind of logging form, if somebody isn't kind of aware, is a really nice way to just kind of see what's happening on a weekly basis. Absolutely. So this is a good thing. And Debbie Lynn kind of gave the check in terms of she tried it and she found it helpful to make a change. So that's the kind of what and the how it's coming in. Now the why is a little bit different. And there is a very helpful worksheet in Buried in Treasures called Advantages and Disadvantages Worksheet. And Earl, if you can put this in the chat. Lipsticks, 542 CoverGirl Brazen Race. Oh, I like that too. It sounds like it's a deep color. That is a great name. So Earl, if you can put that in the chat, and it's clickable here in the presentation books. Oh, I don't even want to get started on books. Yes. So books is another great thing. Books that were given to me, books I had for classes, books I thought I would read and never read, books I've gotten because other family members have passed away and I've kept the books. So other people's books, always expanding. So if there are items, for example, you could pick some that are kind of low in terms of people saying I could have not acquired it, or really high that people feel like it'd be awful if they didn't acquire it. You can pick items in different categories and think, what is the item? What are the advantages or benefits to acquiring? And so, for example, the books, right? What are the advantages? Are you going to read it? Is this something you want to share with somebody? Is this information? What are the benefits? That's the kind of why. Why did you get it? Is it a coffee table book? Is it a book you want to give to somebody? Is it a book you want information to learn about something, right? Those are the advantages. That's the why. Now, the disadvantages are the costs of acquiring, right? Was it expensive? Do you have no space for it? Is it going to stress you out and you can't do anything with it? Those are the disadvantages. So the advantages are really the why. So that gets you into the why is this acquired? Is it that you imagine something for yourself, or you're going to use it, for example, as a stand for something, or you're going to take it out and make origami with it? Like, what do you think is going to happen with it? So this is another form that you can do that. And again, that's available in the chat. Yeah, Debbie Lynn, there's absolutely ways to donate. I have a cousin who did the Peace Corps in the Ukraine, and she's been sending things. It is important to think what's useful for people. So it's always good to go through an organization that'll tell you what people are actually looking for. So that's a really great recommendation. So this is a way to get into the how. So the first one, discovering the what, the how, and the why. Those are great places to do some kind of reflection and get a sense. And those are, again, things that you can give people to work on, that you can actually do with someone. These are things you can try and then share. So lots of different uses for them. But I think logging, very helpful. And even if people decide they don't want to make a change, at least they're aware. Because sometimes if you're not paying attention, a lot can kind of come in and you're not realizing it. Yeah, out of date, they've never been read, just the signature of relatives. Yeah, the question of do you need the thing or a picture of the thing? That's really, and you can make a picture that's an online album or a physical album. That question of like, why do I have it? Is it decorative? Is it sentimental? What about it is sentimental? I think that's a really important thing to think about. No, Lance, you don't need an account. They should all be freely available. You absolutely don't need an account. These are all freely available forms. And if you're having difficulty with them, stay on after and I can take a look. So then step 2, so after figuring out what's happening, you can kind of change your thoughts about acquiring. And I need to keep time into consideration. Excellent. Okay. Oh no, I need to move a lot faster. Sorry. So we talked about in session 1 that there can be a feedback loop where the behavior where you have clutter then makes you kind of feel worse, and then you get more clutter to make you feel better. That's a feedback loop. The same thing happens with acquiring. So you might have some type of trigger. You go to a yard sale, you see something. It could be a social situation. It could be a time of the month, whatever that is. And there's some immediate payoff. It could be relief, right? It could be you're stressed and it relieves you, it relieves discomfort, or it could be joy, that kind of short-term payoff. And those are those advantages on the worksheet that was just shared, right? What are those advantages? So you have that immediate emotional payoff, reduced distress or increased joy, and then regret kicks in. Those are the disadvantages. Was it expensive? Do you have no space for it? Is it creating some type of hardship or difficulty? Is it, blocking use of a toilet? Is it making it less safe in your apartment? Then that brings on often negative conclusions about yourself, about your behavior, what type of a person you are, what type of control or not control you have. So that can lead to feelings of kind of self-loathing, of anxiety, of depression, like those kind of things. And then to cope with that discomfort, because we've talked about in the past that, right, a lot of times cluttering behaviors, acquiring behaviors have to do with the reduction of discomfort, right? Emotional discomfort, social discomfort, and then that cues more acquiring. And so a way to kind of get into this is to think about exploring an acquiring episode to become more aware of it. And so I want you, and try to think about this as we're going. I don't think we have time to get into it. You're being told you do not have access to the exercise. I'm going to take a look at that when Earl's presenting. So give me a moment. So if anybody doesn't have ability to get that stuff, I'll take a look when Earl's presenting. So Earl, can you share this? Explore a recent acquiring episode. This is something you can do to help somebody understand their feedback loop. So think about the emotional state when you have an acquiring trip, whether that's online, whether that's going to a yard sale, doing something on Amazon. It could be for free, buying stuff. What's your emotional state at the beginning of that trip? What's your trigger? Was it a deal? For me, often it's things on sale. Oh, it's 20% off. Oh, it's 20 cents off, right? It could be like, what's that cue? Is it being on sale? Is it being free? So getting into that cue, because everybody's cues are a little different. Then think about what thoughts made acquiring more likely. I need this. This is a good deal. Like what actually were those thoughts associated with the kind of situation and trigger? Then thinking about what's the immediate emotional experience? Is it relief? Is it increased comfort? Is it some type of feeling of success and value? If that's something that's a kind of a joy-seeking behavior. And is there development of regret? Does it happen directly after? Is it later? What is that regret? Is the regret getting something? Is the regret one's financial situation? Think about that. And think about negative conclusions about yourself. Are there negative things that you're saying about yourself? And so this is a great resource. Sale things, absolutely. And that can be a big thing for people. Thank you, Elisa. Absolutely. And I think that getting into these feedback loops, and again, it's not to change everything. And I think that's a great point about dialectical behavioral therapy. It's not changing everything, but it's becoming more aware so that you can interrupt. And so setting rules and asking questions, and I'm so sorry, Earl, I think we're not going to have a break today. So setting rules and asking questions is a way to interrupt the hyper-focus and feedback loop of acquiring. And I want you to pay attention because somebody actually mentioned a rule 1 in, 1 out. So this is a thing you can do to interrupt the feedback. If you're noticing certain behaviors, certain triggers, you can try to interrupt this by creating rules. I cannot get this unless, and these are some rules that are established in Buried in Treasures, but you can change these, add to them. The person can come up with the rules. You can do it with an individual. So I can only get this unless I plan to use it in the next month. I have enough money right now. I can't borrow money. I can't kind of buy it on credit. I have a place to put it so it doesn't clutter. So when I get it, I know where it'll go. I'm sure I truly want to use it. I'm not going to return it. I've had a true need, but not a wish for this item. So those are some rules. So you could also ask the person or have the person ask themselves or get used to asking themselves when they're thinking about acquiring, do I own something similar? Am I buying this because I feel bad right now? Is this just something that I'm trying to like feel better and it'll pass in an hour? And if I, do something else, if I do coping strategies, I won't get this, but it's an immediate feeling. Will I regret getting this in a week? Could I manage without it? Is there enough time to fix or use this? Or do I have other priorities? Is this not something that's a priority for me? Or do I want it because I'm looking at it right now? And so I want you to think about the fact that like these are interruption strategies. You can come up with some firm rules. And of course, the person has to like come up with them or buy into them, but this is a good place to start. These are some rules from Buried in Treasures. You can always change or add. I do like the 1 in, 1 out, or questions to challenge thinking. So I ran over a little. I started late. I apologize. But this is a good place to kind of think about and get started. If people want, I can put this on a separate page if that's helpful and share it at the end. Just let me know in the chat if you'd like this as something separate. I'm happy to do that. But I think I ran over the break, so I'm just going to turn things over to Earl, who's going to talk about steps 3 and 4. So I apologize about that.
Quite all right. We are in a good stead. So obviously, yeah, if it's okay with everyone, we'll just shift through the break and really get into the elements of and move beyond the break, so we can all follow along. So we want to make sure that we get into step 3 and 4, which are really the kind of action steps after going through that process of thinking things through and really understanding the premise, the how, the why we acquire. So we have a great sense of autonomy and the wherewithal to actually take the next step. But before we do that, I want to quickly render a poll and ask you to fill in that information, so I get a sense from you in terms of your understanding about the kinds of acquiring, whether it's free acquiring or purchasing stuff, and its impact on symptomology and severity, and in some instances, its association with comorbidity. So I'm going to quickly get a poll up so that you can give me some feedback. So I'm going to launch that poll. If you could take a few seconds, I would certainly appreciate that. So the first element of the question of the poll is, how common is it for people with clinically significant hoarding to acquire excessively but not recognize it? And then we certainly look at whether or not the both styles of acquisition or acquiring is really associated with whether it's a milder or more severe case of hoarding, and some association with both significant symptomology and some comorbidity. So if we can quickly get some feedback, that would give us a good premise to move into our next step. So fantastic. So I will end the poll in about 3 seconds, and then we can kind of get a sense as to where things are. Thank you. So I'll end the poll now and look at the responses. So the question is, how common is it for people with clinically significant hoarding problems to acquire excessively but not recognize it? And that's what I was expecting in some regards. In terms of the folks who looked at it as it's extremely common, more than 3/4 of you said it was extremely common to have that kind of lack of recognition in terms of excessive hoarding, and we'll look at the types of excessive acquiring. But we had certainly a third of folks that say somewhat, so I can see that in some regards, and we'll talk some more about that. Do hoarders who engage in both buying and acquisition of free things generally have more severe symptoms and greater comorbidity than those who acquire via one method? Yes, resoundingly. The response is yes, and that's the answer. There's research that's very significant in 2009 that was done by Frost, Tolin, and some other folks, really showed and indicated that there is a significant correlation between the two types of acquisition and its association with severe symptomology. So it's great, and thank you. Lisa says, I'm bummed my company didn't share this till last week. Oh, okay. Great, the worksheet, yeah, and that's fine. Hopefully we'll get it in a timely manner so we can kind of keep track, but thank you for sharing that, Alice. So non-acquiring help card, and I think Shelley really delved into that earlier. I just wanted to kind of keep that in mind in terms of really understanding how keeping track of that information and the guidance associated with this card can really help you to get a sense as to where you are in terms of your acquisitions. So it's both the goals that you set out for yourself as a strategy to ameliorate the acquisition. And there are some rules that are important here. And Shelley mentioned them in terms of, only if you plan to use it within the next month and have a place to put it and it doesn't add to the clutter. And then certainly some questions to ask yourself as a precipice for really making a decision about whether something is important to acquire and how it's going to impact your current state of acquisition. So what's important in terms of utilizing this non-acquiring help card is to ensure that you follow along with the guidelines in terms of it, including the goals, the rules, and questions, and to really operationalize those strategies to give you a great sense, and then make sure that when you've completed that card and it's completed comprehensively, you use it as a guide, as a point of reference when encountering triggers. So it's about completing that form and carrying it and using it as a point of reference whenever there's a question or any kind of psychological challenge in that area, to really use it as a guide and a point of reference. So anyone see this? How do you see this non-acquiring card being utilized both by yourself and people that you serve? In terms of someone actually carrying it as a card that they can pull out and use when they're faced with challenging situations associated with acquiring. How do you see that? Do you see that as something substantive, something that is going to be in great utility that folks are likely to use? Go ahead, Shelley.
I'm so sorry. So Oxford University Press changed their permissions. So I'm going to figure this out and let you guys know. It might get emailed to you afterwards. I really apologize. This has been since like a week ago. So they just updated their permissions and made a lot of things not accessible. So I apologize.
Thanks, Shelley. And hopefully we'll get a chance to resolve it or at least get you some access. So bear with us. So once we have that sense of using that card, I think it's going to be very meaningful. So quickly to kind of step into the third strategy and prior to doing that, I just want to share with you my own experience in terms of being triggered in a sense, and how it's ubiquitous and it's just omnipresent for most of us. I had the privilege of going to the Adirondacks in New York City. We typically do that every year as a family. We really enjoy the cabin and the lake and so forth. But I came upon this store that was in the center of town, and this is what it actually looked like. And it just resonated with me profoundly. Think of coming across this particular, not a picture, but the actual reality of it, stepping into a place you're going for vacation, relax, get away from all the stresses, get away from all the things that are overwhelming, and you're faced with this as the primary attraction in the town of Lake Brand. I'm putting it out there. It's actually the little shop of hoarders. How intense a trigger do you think this can be? I like that, Melanie. Melanie said, great name.
Yes.
Certainly.
I think for some people, it will pull them right in, and for others, they will have no desire to walk through the doors.
I agree. It's either one extreme or the other. You either get, that gravitational pull, or you run like heck in the opposite direction. So that's just to remind, that reminder that triggers to acquire can be anything, and oftentimes anywhere. It's a thing you see, hear, or otherwise experience gets you really thinking about acquiring. It can unleash such powerful urges to acquire that sometimes it seems impossible to control. And as much as I had that sense that this is unbelievable, what was also significant about this is that somewhere outside of the store, it had this theme of it's the anti-throwaway culture that they're responding to. Think of that. Great novel way of putting it, but it certainly had its impact. So I just wanted to share that with you and to give a sense as to how much it's present, how much it really impacts us wherever we go. And we have to be conscientious and aware. And it's a great segue into step 3, which is learning to tolerate your triggers. And as we know how powerful triggers can be and how overwhelming it can seem in terms of even the idea of attempting to control it. And we also know that certainly short-term solutions is our first approach, our first step. It's probably the most common approach to it, but it's very challenging to do that in a sustainable way, just avoiding. So we have to, at some point, acquire the knowledge, skills, and resources and confidence to really learn how to tolerate our triggers. And it's important because it lends to us a set of strategies or approaches that really should be at our fingertips, because as I just indicated to you, the triggers are everywhere. So in terms of the triggers, you talk about those powerful urges, the short-term solution is obviously to avoid, but ultimately the long-term solution is really learning how to tolerate those triggers. So there's certainly a lot of approaches to get to that step and to move intentionally towards the goal of resolving the temptations and getting into a place of confidence in terms of figuring out how best to manage those triggers, and then really make some actionable steps to change our environment and change the circumstances around it. So the second step in this strategy is really to create a non-acquiring hierarchy. So it's listing all acquiring triggers you can think of and the urge and use an urge and discomfort scale to really give you a sense as to how you really deal with them as you encounter them. So basically, you're expected, or what is the guidance here is for you to really look at the triggers that you list, establish those triggers, and then rank them from the least to the most discomfort. And then I'll certainly show you one example in the book of how that particular scaling was used to really get us folks to slowly expose themselves to more profound triggers, starting with those lesser ones and then gradually moving to more significant triggers, and really gauging your ability and success at tolerating the triggers over time. So in terms of creating that non-acquiring hierarchy, it's really getting you in preparation for the practice to expose yourself gradually to the triggers on your list. And there are some elements in terms of how to operationalize that particular practice of gradual exposure. So after listing that, the list of triggers and really putting it in a hierarchy in terms of the most significant or the most profound, and really looking at it through that prism, through that scale, in some instances, when we're exposing ourselves to those triggers, the guidance here, the expectation is that you consider a chaperone, and I hate to use that term, but that's probably the best term I can use, someone who can accompany you, who has an awareness and a knowledge of the triggers and how they can support you in that element. So it's not someone who is going to be there to tell you what to do, but to kind of give you that gentle reminder and guidance and support as you process through exposure. So that's important to think of someone who can play that role for you, who can be there to support you as you expose yourself. I think certainly in the case of going to the Saturday yard sale, someone who says, hey, remember your rule is if you don't have a place for it, you shouldn't acquire it. Or you can actually touch it and hold it, but go through that process of answering those questions that you have on your non-acquiring list to determine whether or not that is something that you can do. And then keep a record of the discomfort, the level of discomfort, or the rate of discomfort on a 0 to 10 scale, 0 being least discomfort, 10 being the most discomfort, in terms of where you are as you're exposed to more graduating or more significant or more profound triggers. So you get a sense as to how you are managing your own emotional connection with exposure to those triggers. So that's kind of the steps that are established for developing that acumen to tolerate triggers and gradually exposing yourself while developing your tolerance over time. So the question then is, what's the situation that's triggered you to acquire? And how do you see yourself going through that 3-step process of developing tolerance to acquiring? So think of a situation that's triggered you to acquire. What is probably the most significant one? I've watched my grandmother, and I'm trying to keep up, so bear with me. Sure. And I've seen over again is when the store clerk is open to haggling. Yes, I know that certainly can be significant for a lot of folks. Starting a project of some kind that requires a bunch of things I don't currently have. Good sales at Target. Yes, I certainly can empathize with that. It's right there. It's really profound in your face, and it's hard to not look at it that way. What's significant is in terms of from planning to practice, once we think of keeping that record of our discomfort, and we suggest that people do that if you go and expose yourself, if you're doing that exposure concept of it, every 10 minutes to keep track of your level of discomfort so that you can have a sense as to what's the most profound elements that really significantly establish that discomfort for you. Because at the end of it, what you're expected or what you'd like to see happen is that you, as you practice not acquiring and buying, you see that nothing bad happens when you don't acquire, and your urge to acquire will become weaker. So the concept is, as you begin to expose yourself more and more, and you rate that level of discomfort, you will see that that discomfort can pass as you experience, traverse through it, and then you'll get a sense of that of nothing really bad happened in that moment. Every 10 minutes, you can kind of do that, and over time, see how graduating you can become more and more tolerant of that discomfort. And I see Melody says books, absolutely. That's a challenging one because they're so tangible. So in chapter 8, we reviewed Bill's non-acquiring hierarchy, and he was able to kind of list the things that are significant in terms of both the discomfort and the triggers. In terms of when we look at it, he says picking up a treasure that someone has left on the curb creates the most discomfort. And similarly, picking up things at a dollar store without buying. So it's really to get a sense as to what creates the greatest discomfort as you expose yourself more and more to your graduating triggers. So what's helpful, and I'll quickly run through this, in terms of recognizing the signs that you're triggered, because oftentimes we're not, particularly when we're the trolls of that exposure, we're not certain what's the triggering element. Oh, when we are triggered, what signs should we look for? Even if we have that shopper and that person supporting us, how will they know we are triggered? How can they support us by giving us that cue into recognizing our signs of trigger? So we'll look at some of the signs of that helps you recognize your triggers, and from physical sensations to emotional outbursts can really give us a sense as to how triggering something is and how much we are triggered. So there are some unique telltale signs, and the sooner you recognize your trigger, the easier it is to begin the practice of really shifting your state, and we'll talk about that quickly. So some of the physical sensations, you feel that thing in your stomach, your jaws begin to clench, we feel hot, our eyes begin to water. Some folks even hyperventilate. And some of the judging thoughts that we begin to really play out in our heads as we experience that kind of physical sensation, we start blaming others for the situation. We find fault with the person or thing that is triggering to us. Why they have all of these sales every Saturday? Why do they do it around holidays? Why do they have to do it when my favorite show is watching? Why the advertisements are so associated with all the things that I like to acquire? Easy to get into that mode of that kind of judging thoughts. Oftentimes obsessively repeating thought patterns, replaying the same events repeatedly, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. We play out that whole thought pattern that really keeps us enthralled in that acquisition mode, and it can lead to emotional outbursts. Sometimes hijacking your emotion, it leads to inappropriate outbursts or feelings. You can from slamming things down to cursing out when you went into that sale thinking that you should only spend $20 and left with $100 worth of stuff. So it's important to really get a good sense of your own, recognize your own signs that you're triggered. I know for me, what's significant is that defensiveness, where I begin to establish all those arguments as why I should do it, from a stressful work event to what's going on in my life, or this should make me feel a lot better, and really getting defensive, particularly to the people that matters, that are important to me, people I care about, really defending my behavior, my actions, and then really those judging thoughts that really take over. So if you see some of your telltale signs of your triggers, that will be helpful to really get a sense as to what you should be on the lookout for. So I want to kind of get into quickly into step 4. But what's important to note is that there are some established steps for shifting one's state from that state of being triggered to that state of really addressing that trigger. So it's important to name it. You notice you're triggered, it's quicker to get the sense. I'm triggered, to have that sense. Name it for what it is. Takes space appropriately. We talk about some of those avoiding strategies early on. But then to shift your state, and shifting your state, you can use a number of different techniques and approach to help you shift your state. And the essence of shifting your state is really practicing and cultivating a discipline of not acting when triggered. Then using proven tools to bring you back to a state of balance and inner clarity. And that's important to have that element in place. So I'll give you some examples, and I'm sure some of these state shifting approaches may be very common to you. We talk about mind-body practices such as yoga, tai chi, vigorous physical exercise, dancing, jogging. Jogging works for me. Working out, biking. Feel the feelings, self-soothing, meditation. For some people, prayer, self-humor, connecting to your higher purpose, reminding yourself what's important to you in your general life, and to change your physical environment. So those are just some of the steps, and then you respond to the situation by putting those things into practice. So I'm going to quickly get us into step 4, which is developing alternative sources of enjoyment and coping. Because once we're able to tolerate triggers, we have to be able to kind of develop some of those replacement or alternative sources to kind of get us into more healthier states, approaches to enjoyment and really coping. So find replacement activities in and out of the home. So ones that you can quickly reference, and those that you can do both in the home and outside of the home. And that's important to make sure that you have that sense. I just think of some of those activities and brainstorm a list of choices from your list. So once you have a list of those replacement activities, hobbies, feelings and thoughts associated strategies, whether it's meditation, whether it's processing, whether it's really getting into your positive state. It's important to have a list of those that are doable and accessible to you, and then brainstorm the list of choices to really determine the ones that can be done at a moment's notice. And then decide on a mixture of things to do that can be done at home and outside of the home. And then ultimately, what we've seen to work very well for folks is to really post that list of replacement activities and how you brainstorm them in some of what's doable, what's outside of the home, what's inside of the home, and then assign them. So assign yourself some to do, particularly in the first few weeks, so you get into that mode quickly. So you get into that action state. These are some of the things that I'm going to do to kind of get me into that rhythm, get me prepared, get me ready, so that you are not waiting until you're profoundly triggered to really get into that mode. So, and you can see a lot of the alternative coping and problem solving strategies in chapter 5. So what's also important here is that as a coach, a person who's taking on that role of supporting and guiding someone who's experiencing those excessive acquiring challenges, is what kind of guidance and support you offer and how best to offer those supports. So instructions for the coaches. it's important as we move along in terms of helping people through that process of tolerating triggers and then putting a plan into action in terms of how to better cope and to strategize around alternative sources of joy, sources of fun, sources of positive engagement. It's to help the person stay on task and offer polite reminders, prompts, provide emotional support. A good example is, this must be hard for you. I know what it's like to be exposed to that kind of trigger and feel overwhelmed by it and have to step back and feel like the avoiding strategies that you have hasn't worked as well. Really be emotional in terms of your support. Help with decision-making with questions, but do not make decisions for that person. The good question is, do you really need this? What are the advantages and disadvantages of passing this up? Will this add something new to what you have? Be a cheerleader. That's my favorite role. Congratulate that person for being brave. Tell him or her you know they can do it. Push that envelope in terms of motivation, empathy, support, and yet be that cheerleader. Pull out the pom-poms and be there for that person. And then they're the don'ts, the things that you shouldn't do. Don't take over decision-making for that person. It's their decision to make. You have to trust in their empowerment and their process of moving through the process. And as a support, as a person who's working with someone, don't work beyond your own tolerance. You have to take good care of yourself in order to be able to support, guide, and be there for that person. So you have to be aware of your own self-care and be a good coach. You need to take care of yourself while helping others, and set limits on how long and how much you will do with folks as you move through that process. So those are step 3 and step 4 in terms of how you learn to tolerate your triggers, and then developing alternative sources of joy and coping to really help you get into that rhythm of positive, healthy coping mechanisms. So quickly, I will shift over so Shelley, we can bring things to a conclusion for today. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay, great. I didn't realize we were shifting back, but I'm happy to
I'm
do it.
sorry.
That's no problem.
I wanted to give you a last kind of.
Sure, no problem.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Earl. This had a lot of information, and I think this is indicative of what's going to happen in the next couple of chapters. It is so much focused on practice. And as I mentioned a little bit in the chat, it is important to think about that the tools, the place you are in the book, it really depends on the individual. You may need to go back to earlier chapters and do resources. So it is important that we're doing this over the course as progressive over the course of the year. But not all resources are appropriate for people at all moments. So I really appreciate people bringing that up and some concerns. And so these things are important to think about, and absolutely continue to bring them up. So Earl, can you put the evaluation in the chat? So as always, it's helpful to have evaluation feedback. This is Earl's first time presenting. And so, any feedback you have in terms of what's working, what's not working well, would you like to see more of something? Is something working really well? That's going to help him. So thank you so much in terms of participation, sticking with us. This is our 7th of 12, which is very exciting. As I mentioned in the chat, Oxford University Press over the last week, because Earl and I checked these things last week, stopped allowing, they should have realized these are the most helpful things, and they made the access proprietary, which is a real, which is really terrible. I understand that people need to make money. I'm sure it's the publisher, not the authors. But we're going to investigate other ways to make these things available. What I did was in the chat, I put the book and that book chapter, which is maybe not the best thing in terms of copyright, but all the things that we shared, the help card, the non-acquiring form, what you can do is what I often do is, if you can't, you can see it in the book chapter, which I just put back, which is chapter 8. You can make them in a Word document. You could even draw it. So those resources are there. We're going to figure it out for next month, but just in that case, we want to make things accessible, but copyright has changed. So it might be helpful to kind of take a look at them and kind of make it yourself, even if it's writing it out. Again, the stuff is not like you can keep a log without having the formal buried in treasures log. So I just want to put that out there. We are going to ask for this month, the learning application is to try or share some of these resources. This is different since it's not like an easy link like it was, but they're in the book chapter. And if you want to try, it's going to be harder to share. If you want to try with yourself, looking at the chapter I just shared, or try it with someone you're working with, think about my acquiring. Is there somebody who it might be good for them to log what they're doing? Explore a recent acquiring episode. Think about the advantages, disadvantages of something they've purchased, or that non-acquiring help card in terms of, are there rules that they want to agree to? And think about what's helpful, what's not helpful. Again, that the inputted kind of chapter, if you have the book, those forms are in there, but that's the best I can do right now on short notice. The next meeting, which is going to be entirely with Earl, which is going to go wonderfully, is August 23rd. From 9:30 to 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Yes, absolutely. Welcome, Earl, to taking over. Very excited about that. And this is going to cover Buried in Treasure, Chapter 9, Sorting and Removing Stuff. Again, this is going to be very resource heavy. So a lot of stuff to go over, but hopefully a lot of good conversation. If you're registered now, you are already registered. And so you'll get the reminder a week before and the same morning of. But thank you so much. I don't want to run over. Just as a reminder, again, there is that monthly meeting. If there's somebody you actually want to, like, in a support group style setting, in terms of if you're working with people, Ashley Craft at the beginning. I don't know, Ashley, if you're still here, if you want to put it again, that is a resource. Somebody asked about it last month, so it's good to have that information. But have a wonderful month, and Earl, will see you next month. Again, it's been such a pleasure. And you're going to get the follow-up with the recording and presentation probably later today or tomorrow. So take care, everyone. And I'm here if anybody has any quick questions. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording now.